Okay, so in this video, I want to show you the process of using Jupyter Notebooks in the Codespaces context. Codespaces being a cloud service that GitHub provides that basically lets you do your coding in the cloud without having to do too much installation. We're going to go through a little bit of installation. So really, we're going to be showing you a couple different tools. One is obviously Jupyter Notebooks in the context of Codespaces, but we're also going to show you how to install and use another tool that we use on the command line. It's a tool called UV, and it's becoming an increasingly popular tool for installing packages in your various projects. We'll go into some of the details of what that technology is once we get to it. But the starting point here is we're assuming that in our class context, you've accepted an assignment from GitHub Classroom, and you've arrived at your GitHub code repository page, which is what I'm on right now. So what you're going to want to do is first and foremost spin up a code space by going to the big green button here that says code and clicking it open. And if it's the first time that you've created a code space on an assignment, which if it's a brand new one, you just accepted the invite for, presumably this is what you'll be seeing. If you previously worked on it, though, you're probably going to see a kind of randomly named pre-existing code space. So that it's fine to just reopen that, like that one if you have previously created it. But at the outset, this is what you're going to see. So I'm going to go ahead and click this big green button, create code space on main. And we will let that run for a few moments. It can take anywhere up to about a minute to kind of get everything set up. If you look in the lower right corner, the pop-up just vanished, but that is kind of letting you know that the environment's being set up. And you should be seeing 3 or 4 different panels here. I'm going to close some of them, and I'll point out the important ones. First off, I'm going to turn off this agent mode panel by just clicking in the upper right corner here. And then the other panels that you might be seeing are the file navigation panel, which also includes a few other buttons. We'll go through the relevant ones in a moment. This is the kind of coding panel where you'll be doing your actual coding. Right now, it's just displaying the readme.md file. And then most importantly, down here towards the bottom, I'm going to kind of simplify this by clearing the screen. But this is actually the terminal. You can kind of turn this on and off by going to the upper right, and you'll see toggle panel. I could turn that on and off, but you're going to want that to be on, and in particular, you're going to want to be on the terminal tab of this panel. And as we discussed in class, this is basically a text-based interface to the operating system. So you might notice if you used a basic shell command to list the contents of the folder, you're going to see that it lists a bunch of files. And actually, if you were to look over in the upper left, it should be mostly the same thing you're seeing up here. There's a couple of so-called hidden files. They start with a dot. You can essentially ignore these for our purposes. So it's not listing all of those because it doesn't do that by default. But this gives you the sense that you are in the file system, but using a text-based interface to it. So in order to get started with creating Jupyter Notebooks using this software, this is actual Visual Studio Code, but it's running on GitHub's Codespaces service. We're going to want to do a few things. The first of them is to actually install a couple of so-called extensions for Visual Studio Code. You can go over to this little extensions icon, and there's a boatload of things you can potentially install, but the 2 that we definitely want are Python. So I'm going to click install on that. And if it doesn't appear up top towards the popular menu, you can also just search up here in the search bar. But let's get rid of that, and hopefully we can just click the ones that we need. So first off, we'll start with Python, and then I'm going to go down to Jupyter, and I'm going to also install that, which in turn triggers a few other bits that need to be installed. And that's really kind of step 1, because those 2 extensions give VS Code the functionality that is important when you're working in a Jupyter Notebook context. So next we can close these tabs in the coding area. and hop back up to the File menu. And the next thing that we're going to do is actually now install a tool, again, I mentioned called UV. And so you actually use a somewhat older tool that some of you may be familiar with called pip. And this is a tool to really install third-party libraries or packages that aren't built in natively to Python, but are really useful that other developers have created that work with Python. And so in order to install the UV package installation tool, you have to actually use pip or pipx, which is kind of a bit of cleaner way to install things. So we're going to just do pipx install UV on this terminal shell and hit the return key. And that should take a few moments to install. And you can see that now we have two new commands. I'm just going to use the UV command when we get to that point. But first things first, let's clear our screen just to kind of reduce some of the noise. And the first step is to initialize our project as a UV managed project. To do that, you need to type UV init on the terminal shell, hit return again, and you're going to notice, well, we got a little bit of feedback here saying the project has been initialized, but you might have also noticed up here in the File Explorer, a bunch of new files appeared. So UV actually auto-generates a little boilerplate file called main.py that gives you kind of an example. We don't need that, so we're going to go ahead and just delete it. I'll do that on the command line, or we can do that here actually. So just get rid of that. It also added a few other files, the most important of which is this pyproject.toml. I'm not going to quite show you what that is yet because it'll make more, or actually, yeah, let's take a look at it. So when you look in here, it's kind of like metadata about your project. Like one of the things it's noting is the fact that we're using a very specific version of Python. And then this area called dependencies, this is going to be a list of the software that we install using UV. So we haven't actually installed any software, and so that is empty for the moment, but let's close this, and let's go back to the command line, and let's install a tool that might be useful to us called requests. This is a library that is widely used to download content from the web, but in a Python context. So I'm just going to do UV space add space requests and hit return. And you can see that a bunch of things happen down here on the shell. But most importantly, if we go to pyproject.toml, I can see that requests is there. I'm going to add one more thing that this project needs because the next person who uses your code might not be working in the exact same environment. So let's also add Jupyter and the IPy kernel. These are two kind of dependencies. Obviously Jupyter for Jupyter Labs, but the underlying IPy kernel, just to be safe, we want to make sure that that's there. That's kind of a core piece of the functionality required by Jupyter Notebooks. So I'm going to also add those. And you can see actually in real time that pyproject.toml was updated with the IPy kernel and the Jupyter dependencies. So we should be good at this point to start experimenting. So say that you were starting a new Jupyter Notebook project. The workflow here would be to come up to this area where you can add new files, new folders, and I'm going to add a new file called hello.ipynb. And this part is really important, that last extension, the ipynb, the file extension, that's what signals to Visual Studio Code that you're working in a Jupyter Notebook context. And so you can see it looks pretty similar to your standard Jupyter Notebook or Colab, if you're familiar with those, just a little bit different. Before you start running off and trying to write code, the very first step, this can be a little confusing, is you have to select what's known as a kernel, which is basically a Python installation. And so I'm going to go ahead and click this button and hop over here, and I'm going to get a couple of options. I'm going to want to choose Python environments. And so it is giving me a couple of options. The one that you want is the one that has been starred. This is the environment that is connected to UV and the environment that it has generated for you. We'll talk a little bit more about those details at the tail end for folks who are don't want to necessarily go into the tall grass. But the important point here is that VS Code is usually pretty good at figuring out which one you want. In this case, it's put a little star next to the FDIC failed banks CSTM Gorin 2. That's going to be specific to me. Yours will be named with your username. And the important part is to make sure that at the tail end it says .venv/bin/python. That is what I'm going to select now. And now that I've done that, you can see in the upper right, I have a notebook that's actually connected to this kernel. So the next final bit is to just test that things are working as expected. So we know we installed the requests library. So test number one really is if I can import it, it means that I've set things up correctly. So I'm going to just try to import requests. I'll hit the play button. And if I get the green check mark, I did, that's a very good sign. So from here, I could, in theory, go on to do some fun things like downloading content off the internet. I'll download this kind of boilerplate page just to show you that it should, in theory, work. We'll find out in a moment. We should probably see a bunch of gobbledygook HTML if this does work. Let's find out. Great. So we actually got the HTML content of this site. If you were to go to example.com, you'd see that there's a big old example domain title on the page and a few other little bits of content. It's just kind of a test case to make sure things are working for us. So one area where you might get tripped up with these workflows is, okay, well, I started a notebook, but now I need some other piece of functionality, like I need to do some data analysis. In that case, you might try to do something like, oh, well, let me add pandas or import pandas. Let's see what happens when I do that. Let's press the play button. Oh, module not found. That's because I haven't installed that software. This is a pretty plain vanilla environment. There's not a lot of pre-installed software besides Python and basic Unix utilities. So this means that in order for pandas to be available, we have to hop back to the terminal at the bottom, on the bottom pane, and once again use uv add pandas and hit return. And that's going to install pandas. So now I can circle back to my notebook, and sometimes this doesn't work. It requires restarting your notebook, but let's see if it now is able to import pandas. Oh, no, that did work. So that's a good sign. So that's basically the workflow for getting your Visual Studio Code set up. Remember, you need to install those extensions over here, primarily Python and Jupyter. And then you need to install the UV tool. It's not strictly required if you're in other classes or working a job or internship, but that's the way we work in this class. We use that because it's, again, being widely adopted in the news community and beyond. So it is a good tool to kind of get comfortable with. And then the final step, of course, is after creating a notebook, making sure you select the appropriate kernel. So those are kind of the steps writ large. Now, at this point, if you don't want to get into the nitty-gritty, you can feel free to shut down that video. But I always encounter students who are curious and want to know, why are we using UV? What is this UV thing all about? And invariably, there are often problems making sure that you select the correct environment or kernel, so-called kernel up here when you open a notebook, and that's very closely related to the fact that we're using UV. So one thing, it was kind of subtle, you may not have noticed, but I should draw your attention to, is that when we first did that UV init command, it auto-generated, or sorry, after we did the init, but when we added our first library, it auto-generated this folder right here, this virtual .venv folder. And what that essentially does is create, you can think of it as like a sandbox environment just for this project. It allows us to track dependencies that are very specific to this project, But in addition, it also lets you track which version of Python. So I'm going to go down the rabbit hole here and actually go into this folder and kind of drill down into it. And you can see that there's a bunch of subfolders. And one of the things that UV does is, I believe it copies in or links to the very specific version of Python that we are using for this particular project. And yeah, that does appear to be a symbolic link. So I won't get into the details of what that is, but just know that UV has connected this particular project to a very specific version of Python. Now, in addition to that, the libraries that we installed are going to wind up in an area called site packages. Again, we're kind of getting into the internals of how Python works. And these libraries in turn draw in quite a few other libraries. Like when you install one, that installs others, which in turn installs others, which is why you're seeing so much here. But basically all we installed were the, let's see here, it was the pandas, requests. Yeah, there's a lot. Jupyter. And let's see if we can even find one of them. So there's pandas, requests will be further down. It's alphabetical. And the main thing to know about this, I don't want you to get too lost in the details, but the reason I'm mentioning this is that the number one question I get is not only how does this work, but also why? Why are we even using UV? And the idea here is that by using UV, you create a very sandboxed environment, one in which the precise versions of all of those pieces of software are tracked and managed in both pyproject.toml, which is kind of like a high-level view of what we've installed. And then I'm not going to open this file up because there's a lot of craziness going on in it, but this contains like the full detail for all these dependencies and their dependencies and those dependencies, kind of going fully down the chain. And so this allows you to really perfectly package up the code that you've written and submit it to your colleagues, your instructors, and they can perfectly recreate that environment so that they don't have problems running the code. This is also useful to you so that when you are going to do another project, say 6 months or a year down the road, if you were just installing these dependencies in your system, what we call system-wide or globally, then you would actually possibly be breaking older projects. So if you do a new project a year from now that requires pandas and pandas has significantly changed, well, it might work on your new project, but it might not work on your old project because some of the interfaces or pieces of code that you used on that original project have changed or evolved. So by using UV, you're able to really kind of recreate the state of affairs when you were first working on that code. So that's essentially the full story. If you wanted all that detail, if not, don't worry about it. Just know that those initial commands that we showed you are very widely adopted and increasingly widespread workflows. And so getting comfortable with those it's going to be a good thing. So I'll end it there. Thanks.